I'm a 28-year-old woman, and for as long as I can remember, family gatherings have felt like walking into a competition I never signed up for. My Aunt Linda always made sure of that. The moment she walked through the door, it was like the air in the room shifted. She carried herself with the kind of confidence that left no room for anyone else's stories. She didn't just share updates about her kids, Claire and Ryan, she turned every conversation into a highlight reel of their so-called perfect lives. Growing up, I learned quickly that holidays weren't about catching up or enjoying each other's company. They were about how high Claire's grades were compared to everyone else, or how Ryan's latest business venture was blowing up. Every Thanksgiving, Christmas, or summer barbecue became a stage for Linda to perform, and the rest of us were just the audience. I still remember my mom's tight smile whenever Linda started her routine, and my dad staring into his plate, clearly uncomfortable. Claire was always presented as the golden child, destined to become a doctor. Straight A's, perfect scores, glowing recommendation letters. Linda made it sound like the universe itself was preparing Claire's path to medical school. If any of the cousins mentioned our own plans, Linda had a way of twisting it to make Claire's achievements shine brighter. Ryan's story was just as glossy. According to Linda, he was some kind of genius entrepreneur, building a startup from the ground up while still juggling classes. She talked about investors, expansion, and networking, though never once could she explain exactly what the business was. When I was younger, I didn't pay too much attention. Kids don't really question what adults brag about, and I assumed maybe Claire and Ryan really were that amazing. But as I got older, the cracks became harder to ignore. The bragging got louder, more exaggerated, and much more dismissive of everyone else. One Thanksgiving not too long ago, I brought up that I had started landing corporate contracts through my event planning business. It was a huge deal for me, something I had worked toward for years. Linda didn't even let me finish before waving her hand and calling it just party organizing. She quickly pivoted back to Ryan's international opportunities, and I sat there realizing she hadn't even bothered to ask about my work. That comment stayed with me. For the first time, I started to look closely at the details she was so eager to throw around. Linda claimed Claire was deep in pre-med courses, yet I never once saw her studying when she visited family events. She seemed tired, distracted, even a little withdrawn, but Linda brushed it off as her being humble about her workload. Ryan, on the other hand, never had anything concrete to show for his so-called business. No website, no brand name, not even a business card. Just vague descriptions like tech solutions or global growth. I began to notice little slips. Once during a conversation at a 4th of July picnic, a cousin mentioned Claire had been working retail. Linda jumped in so fast it was almost comical, saying it was just for fun and character building. Another time, Ryan bragged about flying out for a conference, but couldn't remember which city it was in when someone asked. He brushed it off, saying it was confidential. The more I paid attention, the more things didn't add up. Claire never posted about school, never mentioned exams, and never carried the heavy textbooks you'd expect from someone preparing for medical school. Ryan's so-called business presence online was non-existent. No LinkedIn activity, no press, nothing that would back up Linda's stories. It started to feel like they were living two different lives, one in Linda's words, and another in reality. The real turning point came when a cousin slipped up after a few drinks at a holiday dinner. He mentioned casually that Claire had actually dropped out of her university the year before. He didn't realize Linda was nearby, and the look on her face could have cut glass. She quickly corrected him, saying Claire was taking specialized courses abroad, but the tension in the room told a different story. I filed that away. Once I started looking, evidence appeared everywhere. Ryan had supposedly been running a sneaker reselling operation, nothing like the international startup Linda described. A friend of Claire's admitted she hadn't been in school since freshman year, and that she was struggling to find her footing. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together, and I realized just how much effort Linda had put into building this false picture of her children's success. Instead of confronting her outright, I decided to keep my head down and quietly collect what I noticed. Screenshots, conversations, even just mental notes about contradictions. Linda was so busy spinning her stories that she didn't notice anyone paying close attention. And in truth, most of the family wasn't. They were either too polite to question her or too tired of the drama to bother. But I wasn't going to let it slide anymore. Not after years of having my own life diminished and dismissed. I could see the cracks forming, and I knew that if I waited long enough, the whole picture she had painted would eventually collapse under its own weight. All I had to do was watch, listen, and be ready when the truth finally came to light. After I started paying closer attention to Aunt Linda's stories, we had a big summer barbecue at my cousin's place. These get-togethers always followed the same script. Everyone brought food, the grill fired up, and as soon as Linda arrived, the spotlight landed on her kids. That day was no different. She walked in with a tray of pasta salad and launched straight into an update about Ryan. According to her, his company had just expanded overseas. She used words like international contracts and global partnerships and nodded as if she was in some kind of board meeting, instead of standing in a backyard next to a cooler full of soda cans. I let her finish before asking, casually, what the company was called. Linda gave this little laugh and waved her hand, saying something about how I wouldn't have heard of it anyway. The other relatives chuckled politely, but I noticed a few cousins raised their eyebrows. I didn't push further right there, but the moment stuck in my mind. That night, after I got home, I pulled out my laptop and searched state business records. If Ryan was running a company, it had to be registered. Nothing came up under his name, no LLC, no sole proprietorship, not even a DBA. I searched for a few of the buzzwords he liked to throw around, but there was no trace of anything connected to him. It was exactly what I expected, but seeing it in black and white was different. At that barbecue, Claire had shown up late. She looked tense, barely said a word, and steered the conversation away from school anytime someone asked. I remember hearing her mutter to a cousin that she was taking a break from classes. Linda was quick to jump in, clapping her hands and saying Claire was just too modest to brag about how well she was doing. The switch in tone was so sharp it was almost uncomfortable, but everyone let it slide, as usual. I didn't. A few days later, I reached out to an old friend of Claire's from high school. We'd crossed paths before, so it wasn't awkward to ask. She told me straight out that Claire had dropped out during her first year of college and hadn't gone back. She was working part-time in retail to cover her bills. That was about as far as you could get from medical school prep. The friend didn't sound surprised at all, just tired of hearing Linda's fantasy version of her daughter's life. From there, I dug a little deeper into Ryan's story. An acquaintance who had interned at the same firm Ryan supposedly worked for told me he had been fired after a few months. His business was nothing more than reselling sneakers online. He bought limited releases, marked them up, and flipped them for profit. There's nothing wrong with that as a hustle, but it wasn't exactly the kind of international startup Linda bragged about. I started documenting everything, screenshots of online searches, messages from people who knew the truth, even just bullet point notes of contradictions I heard in real time. I wasn't ready to confront Linda yet, but I wanted to have all my ducks in a row when the moment came. A few weeks later, we had another family dinner. As usual, Linda showed up with new stories. This time, Ryan was apparently invited to a tech conference in another state. She dropped it into conversation like it was casual, but I caught the way she looked around, waiting for reactions. I leaned forward and asked which conference. She blinked, stalled for a second, then said it was private and invite only. That didn't sit right. Every real conference has a name, even if it's industry-specific. The room went quiet for a second before someone changed the subject, but I caught a few cousins exchanging skeptical glances. It was subtle, but I could see the tide shifting. For years, Linda had controlled the narrative, and nobody challenged her. Now, her answers weren't landing the same way. People were starting to notice the holes. After dinner, I went home and checked online for tech conferences happening that month in our area. There were several, but none were invite-only. All of them had public registration, websites, and lists of speakers. Ryan's name wasn't on any of them. Another note for my growing collection. Around the same time, another cousin reached out to me privately. She had noticed Claire avoiding school talk and Ryan's vague answers too. She asked if I thought something was off. I didn't spill everything I knew, but I admitted I'd been paying attention. She seemed relieved, like she wasn't the only one anymore. By then, I had a folder on my computer dedicated to all of this. Screenshots of business searches, photos of Ryan hanging out at sneaker shops, snippets of conversations about Claire working retail. It wasn't about malice, it was about being prepared. Linda had turned family events into competitions for years, and if she wanted to keep making it about her kids, then the truth needed to stand next to her lies. The next big test came at another family gathering, this time at my uncle's house. Everyone was sitting around the table when Linda launched into her usual routine. She bragged about Ryan networking with CEOs and Claire being on track for medical school interviews. I kept my tone casual as I asked which hospitals Claire was interviewing with, since I knew someone who worked in admissions. Linda froze for a split second before saying it was confidential. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was heavy. Claire shifted uncomfortably in her chair, and Ryan jumped in to brag about his international partners. Again, I asked which companies. He muttered something about confidential contracts. The words were the same, the excuses recycled. Only this time, people noticed. I saw the way relatives leaned back, the way their expressions changed. I didn't push further that night. I didn't need to. The cracks were spreading on their own. Claire's hesitation, Ryan's fumbling answers, Linda's overreactions. They were all painting a picture that didn't match the one Linda had tried to sell for so long. By the end of that evening, I knew I didn't have to chase the truth. It was already coming out, piece by piece. All I had to do was keep asking simple questions and let their own contradictions do the work. And sure enough, as I left that dinner, one of my cousins caught me at the door. She whispered that she was glad someone was finally asking questions, because everyone had been thinking the same thing, they just didn't want to be the first to say it. That was the moment I realized Linda's control was slipping. For the first time, her perfect image wasn't untouchable anymore. Christmas rolled around, and like always, the family gathered at my grandmother's house. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon pies filled the air, kids ran through the halls, and adults carried trays of food to the long dining table. When Aunt Linda arrived, she came in brimming with energy, her voice carrying over the chatter like a spotlight turning on. She carried not just her usual dish, but also a heavy leather photo album tucked under her arm. As soon as coats were hung and greetings made, she set the album on the coffee table with a dramatic flair. She flipped it open for everyone to see, revealing pages of graduation pictures of Claire. The photos showed Claire in a cap and gown, holding a rolled-up paper tied with a ribbon, posing in front of a backdrop of flowers. At first glance, they looked impressive, but the longer I looked, the more off they seemed. There was no crowd in the background, no classmates, no stage, no banners, nothing that screamed real ceremony, just Claire standing alone in different corners of what looked like a backyard. Linda narrated each page with pride, pointing out Claire's academic journey and the next steps toward medical school. A few relatives nodded politely, though I caught some cousins glancing at each other, their expressions skeptical. Claire sat quietly on the couch, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Ryan took the cue to jump in, sliding into the armchair beside his mother. He cleared his throat and announced that he had just sealed a huge investment deal. He said his company was working with international partners in tech solutions. The words sounded polished, but there were no details. No names of companies, no description of projects, nothing that anyone could latch onto. I leaned forward, pretending to scroll on my phone. I typed loudly enough for people nearby to notice. "I'll look it up," I said lightly. All eyes turned toward me as I tapped away. A few seconds later, I announced that I couldn't find anything online about Ryan's company. No website, no business listing, no press release, nothing. Ryan shifted in his seat, his face turning red. He muttered something about confidentiality agreements and how not everything was public yet. His voice cracked just enough for people to notice. I didn't let the moment pass. Calmly, I explained that I had already checked the state business filings weeks earlier. There was no company registered under his name. The words hung in the air like smoke. The table went quiet, forks and knives paused midair, and everyone stared. Linda cleared her throat and tried to deflect, talking about how young entrepreneurs sometimes operate under the radar. But the room had shifted. For the first time, people weren't nodding along to her stories. They were exchanging uneasy glances, whispering to each other, wondering what else wasn't true. I decided to push just a little further. I turned to Claire, who was still staring at her plate. I asked about her acceptance to medical school, keeping my tone casual. I mentioned I knew someone in admissions at one of the universities Linda often bragged about. The room went silent again, all eyes on Claire. She froze, her fork clattering against the plate. After a long pause, she muttered under her breath that she wasn't actually enrolled anywhere. She admitted it quietly, like she wanted it to disappear the moment it left her mouth. Linda jumped in instantly, framing it as a personal gap year. She said Claire was just taking time to explore her options, that she didn't want to rush into such an important decision. But the excuses sounded thin. Nobody at the table looked convinced. Relatives exchanged looks, some with raised brows, others shaking their heads. The room didn't erupt into shouting or confrontation. It was quieter than that, and somehow worse for Linda. The silence itself was telling. The pride and applause she expected never came. Instead, there was doubt. Dinner carried on, but the energy had shifted completely. Conversations turned to other topics. Holiday travel, kids' school plays, upcoming weddings. Nobody circled back to Linda's photo album or Ryan's investment deal. It sat on the coffee table untouched, pages half-turned, the glossy images losing their shine under the dim light. Claire eventually excused herself to the kitchen, and Ryan buried himself in his phone, no longer volunteering information. Linda tried a few more times to redirect conversations toward her children, but her words floated without landing. The grip she used to have on the room wasn't there anymore. After dessert, as people started packing leftovers and saying their goodbyes, I noticed the way relatives whispered in the hallway. A cousin leaned over to another, shaking his head. An uncle muttered something about stories not adding up. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet unraveling, the kind that spreads further once people leave and talk about it later in their own homes. As I put on my coat, I glanced back at Linda. She sat stiffly in her chair, forcing a smile, but her eyes darted nervously around the room. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her at a family gathering. The weight of the lies was starting to catch up. By the time I stepped outside into the cold December night, I knew things would never be the same. The illusion Linda had built for years was no longer bulletproof. It was cracking, and everyone had seen it with their own eyes. The stories no longer carried the same weight. New Year's brunch was hosted at my uncle's house that year, and the mood felt different from the start. After Christmas, people had begun whispering behind closed doors, trading observations about Linda's tall tales. By the time we all gathered again, there was an edge in the air. No one wanted another night of pretending everything added up. Linda still walked in with her usual confidence, dressed in bright colors and carrying a plate of pastries. She smiled broadly, greeted everyone, and within minutes, she was back at it. She announced that Claire had been headhunted for a prestigious research fellowship. She talked about labs, discoveries, and opportunities, sprinkling in words like breakthrough and cutting edge. The way she delivered it sounded rehearsed, as though she'd practiced it on the way over. The room went quieter than usual. My uncle asked a simple question about what city the lab was in. Linda opened her mouth but stalled. She hesitated long enough for Claire to shift uncomfortably in her seat. I followed up, asking about the project itself. Which field? What specific focus? Claire stared down at her plate, her fork scraping against it, not saying a word. Ryan jumped in to cover the silence. He leaned forward and started bragging about his company's international partners. He spoke quickly, listing vague countries like Germany and Singapore, but no actual names. He tossed around words like network and partnership, but never gave a solid detail. The relatives around the table weren't buying it anymore. I could see it in their faces. My cousin leaned back in her chair with her arms crossed. Another cousin raised his eyebrows, and my aunt shook her head slightly. I excused myself for a moment and stepped outside to make a quick call. I had a friend who worked in university research administration. I asked if she could check whether any fellowship program existed under Claire's name. Within minutes, she confirmed there wasn't. Not at her university, not anywhere else. When I stepped back inside, the table was still quiet. I mentioned casually that I couldn't find any record of the fellowship program Linda was describing. The silence that followed was sharp. Linda tried to laugh it off, saying sometimes programs weren't public, but no one looked convinced. Then came the moment that shifted everything. My uncle, who had been quiet for most of the meal, finally spoke up. He said he was tired of hearing about programs, jobs, and deals that never seemed to check out. His words landed hard. Linda's face flushed, and she scrambled to defend herself. But the damage was done. Claire pushed back her chair, excused herself, and disappeared into the hallway. She looked pale, as if the pressure was finally too much. Ryan stood abruptly, muttering about how the family was meddlesome, and stormed toward the kitchen. The rest of us sat there in stunned silence. Other cousins began exchanging pointed looks. For the first time, Linda wasn't just being doubted by me. Her credibility was unraveling in front of everyone. The rest of the brunch felt tense. Conversations moved on to other topics, but the mood had changed. No one laughed at Linda's stories anymore. They didn't even ask follow-up questions. Her words hung in the air and then dissolved without response. Later, when dessert was served, Linda tried one more time to reclaim her hold on the room. She brought up how Ryan was preparing to pitch his company to Silicon Valley investors. She described it like it was the next big tech revolution. This time, my cousin cut her off, asking what the company was called. Linda blinked, Ryan reappeared from the kitchen, and they both stumbled over their words. The cousins smirked and shook their heads, ending the conversation before it could even get going. After everyone started leaving, the whispers began again. In the hallway, cousins muttered about how fake the stories sounded. An aunt quietly said she wasn't going to waste any more energy entertaining Linda's lies. By the time coats were grabbed and cars warmed up, the family dynamic had changed. Linda wasn't the star anymore. She was the spectacle. The following week, word spread quickly. Cousins who hadn't even been at the brunch were calling, saying they'd heard about what happened. Relatives started piecing things together, remembering inconsistencies from past gatherings, noticing how Claire always avoided questions, how Ryan never gave details. The stories that once held the family captive now just fueled gossip about how far Linda had gone. Claire began skipping smaller family meetups altogether. If she did show up, she stayed quiet, kept her head down, and avoided her mother's spotlight. Ryan grew louder, trying to compensate, but the more he talked, the less anyone believed him. By the end of January, the shift was permanent. Linda still bragged, but her audience was gone. Conversations flowed around her, cousins deliberately changing topics, uncles redirecting attention to real achievements, new jobs, kids' school events, home projects. Linda sat there smiling tightly, but the sparkle in her words no longer reached anyone. The illusion had cracked wide open. A few weeks after the New Year's brunch, Linda's mask began slipping faster. Word about the fellowship lie had already reached cousins who hadn't even been there, and suddenly everyone had questions about what else might not be true. Instead of backing down, Linda doubled down. She called my mom one night, furious, claiming I was trying to ruin her family's image. My mom told her to calm down, but by then it was obvious Linda felt cornered. The next big family event was a cousin's engagement party. It was held at a rented hall, decorated with twinkling lights and tables full of food. Everyone was in good spirits, talking about wedding plans and showing off rings. When Linda arrived, she tried to step right back into her old role, raising her voice to talk over conversations and directing attention to Claire and Ryan. But this time fewer people responded. Conversations flowed past her, people turned back to their plates, and her smile faltered. Ryan tried to pick up the slack. He leaned against the bar, telling a group of relatives that he had been working with investors in New York. He talked about deals, contracts, and partners, but when someone asked if he had a business card, he stuttered. He patted his pockets and muttered about running out. The group exchanged looks and drifted away, leaving him standing alone. Claire kept her head down for most of the night. She busied herself helping the bride-to-be with decorations, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might ask about school. She smiled faintly when thanked, but never joined the spotlight. Later in the evening, another cousin pulled me aside. He whispered that Ryan had been asking around for loans. Apparently, he'd told different relatives different stories, needing money for startup expenses, for travel to meet investors, and even to cover payroll. The amounts weren't small either. A few $100s here, $1,000 there. That explained why he was so desperate to maintain the business facade. Then came Linda's big move of the night. During dessert, she pulled out a framed letter. She held it up like a trophy and announced that Claire had been accepted into a graduate program. She waved it around as if it was proof against all the whispers. The letter had the university's name at the top, but something about it looked off. The font was slightly outdated, and the logo was one I recognized from years back. I discreetly snapped a photo when she set it on the table. While the cake was being passed around, I texted the picture to my friend in admissions. Within minutes, she confirmed what I suspected. The letter was fake. It had been copied from an old template that the university no longer used. I didn't even have to say anything at first. Word spread on its own. Relatives leaned over, whispering as they looked at the photo on my phone. One of them compared it to an actual acceptance letter their own child had received last year, pointing out the mismatched formatting. Another cousin muttered that the wording was identical to a sample letter online. The whispers grew until half the table knew. Someone finally asked Linda why the letter looked so different. Linda's face tightened. She claimed it was just an older format and that people were overanalyzing. But the room wasn't buying it. The bride's father, who had worked in higher education for years, flat out said the letter was not authentic. That was the nail in the coffin. Claire flushed red, stood up, and hurried off toward the restroom. Ryan slammed his fork onto his plate and muttered about the family being toxic. Linda tried to salvage the moment, raising her voice and insisting that everyone was against her children, that people were jealous. But no one defended her. Instead, the relatives sat in silence, letting her rant bounce off empty air. By the end of the night, Linda's last attempt at maintaining her facade had collapsed. She had crossed into outright forgery, and everyone knew it. What had once been exaggerated bragging was now exposed as deliberate lying. The cousins avoided her. Uncles and aunts shook their heads, and the bride made sure to steer the spotlight back to her engagement, refusing to let Linda hijack the celebration any longer. As we left the hall, I overheard relatives talking in the parking lot. One uncle muttered that Linda had gone too far this time. Another aunt said she no longer trusted a single word Linda said. The respect she had once commanded was gone, replaced by suspicion and quiet disgust. After that night, the family dynamic shifted permanently. Linda's stories were no longer entertainment, they were warnings. Every time she spoke, people leaned back, waiting for the holes to show. Claire and Ryan, once untouchable in Linda's eyes, now carried the weight of her lies wherever they went. The forgery wasn't just the end of her credibility. It was the moment everyone realized how far Linda was willing to go to keep her fantasy alive. And that was something the family couldn't ignore anymore. After the engagement party disaster, the fallout spread quickly. Linda had shown up with that fake acceptance letter, and once it was exposed, there was no recovering her credibility. For years, people had let her bragging slide, but this time she had crossed into something no one could defend. In the weeks that followed, the consequences started showing not just for Linda, but for Claire and Ryan too. The first sign came when one of my cousins spotted Ryan working at a local electronics store. He was in a branded polo shirt, stocking shelves, very much not running a global startup. Word spread almost instantly. By the next family Sunday dinner, several relatives had already heard about it. A couple of cousins even joked about Ryan giving them an employee discount. It wasn't mean-spirited, but it made the reality impossible to ignore. Claire wasn't spared either. Another cousin saw her behind the register at a clothing store in the mall. She looked tired, juggling customers and folding sweaters. Again, nothing wrong with retail work, but compared to the image Linda had painted, future doctor, brilliant researcher, it was a sharp contrast. Relatives quietly acknowledged it, and the whispers started stacking up. When Sunday dinner rolled around, Linda still showed up, but the swagger was gone. She set her casserole on the table and sat down, trying to start conversations like old times. Instead of bragging, she floated a new narrative. Her kids were taking time to explore their paths. She said it with a smile, waiting for the applause she used to get. But the table stayed quiet. Relatives nodded politely, changed the subject, and moved on. Ryan tried to reclaim some dignity. Halfway through dinner, he pulled out his laptop and announced he had a business plan to share. He clicked through slides filled with generic buzzwords, stock charts, and copied numbers. At first, people humored him, watching in silence. But when I asked about startup costs, projected revenue, or client names, his answers wobbled. He dodged specifics, circled back to the same vague phrases, and eventually started repeating himself. An uncle who ran his own small business leaned forward, studied the numbers on Ryan's slides, and pointed out that the figures looked copied from generic templates anyone could find online. He even recognized the stock graphics. The room shifted. Ryan's face turned red, his voice grew defensive, and then in frustration, he slammed the laptop shut. He stormed out of the dining room, muttering about people not supporting his dreams. The silence that followed was heavy. No one chased him. Claire stayed seated, staring down at her plate. After a while, she slipped into the kitchen, whispering something to a cousin on the way out. That cousin later told me, Claire admitted she wished her mom would stop pushing lies. The evening carried on, but Linda was noticeably subdued. She tried to steer conversations back to her kids, but the energy was gone. Relatives responded with short answers, then shifted to talking about their own lives, vacations, promotions, kids' achievements. For the first time, Linda wasn't the center of attention, and her attempts to reclaim the spotlight fell flat. Over the next few weeks, the ripple effects kept spreading. Ryan's job at the electronics store became common knowledge. Cousins would nudge each other when they saw him there. Not to mock, but because the contrast to his CEO stories was too glaring. Claire, meanwhile, quietly picked up more retail hours. She stopped showing up to some family dinners altogether, and when she did come, she stayed close to the kitchen, avoiding the main table. Linda, however, wasn't ready to give up completely. At another family gathering, she tried a softer approach. Instead of bragging about Claire's studies or Ryan's business, she framed their struggles as temporary setbacks. She talked about resilience, about how every success story has challenges. But again, no one responded the way she wanted. Conversations drifted back to other topics, leaving her words hanging in the air. The real shift came when one of the younger cousins asked, point blank, if Ryan's company even existed. The question cut through the room like a knife. Linda fumbled, Ryan stayed silent, and Claire excused herself. The rest of the family exchanged looks, but no one jumped in to save Linda this time. By then, relatives had started confiding in me privately. One aunt admitted she had always suspected Linda exaggerated but had never wanted to stir conflict. Another cousin told me she used to feel inadequate every time Linda compared their kids to Claire and Ryan, but now she realized how fake it all was. The lies hadn't just propped up Linda's kids, they had put everyone else down. The final straw that night was when dessert was served. Normally, Linda would use that moment to tell another story, drawing the spotlight one last time before people left, but she stayed quiet, staring at her plate while the rest of the family laughed and shared updates about their own lives. For once, the evening ended without Linda's voice dominating the room. The consequences were clear. Ryan was no longer the untouchable entrepreneur, he was just another retail employee, struggling to maintain his image. Claire wasn't the future doctor, she was a young woman working part-time, trying to figure out her next step. And Linda, who had built her entire identity on their supposed success, was left with nothing but silence. The pedestal she had stood on for years was gone, replaced by polite nods and sideways glances. The family no longer believed her stories, and her grip on the room had finally slipped away. By the time spring rolled around, the shift in the family was obvious. For years, Linda had commanded every gathering with her voice, her stories, her children's supposed accomplishments. Now she sat off to the side, trying to push her way back into the spotlight, only to be brushed aside. Conversations once dominated by Ryan's business ventures and Claire's medical school track now flowed naturally about vacations, promotions, and the kids running around the living room. The silence that followed Linda's comments spoke louder than anything she'd ever bragged about. Easter dinner was at my grandmother's house, as it always was. The table was set with pastel napkins, baskets of eggs, and ham roasting in the oven. People arrived in groups, laughing and carrying desserts, until Linda finally walked in. She was later than usual, looking worn down, her makeup less sharp, her clothes less polished. Behind her trailed Claire and Ryan. Neither of them looked eager to be there. Claire immediately slipped into the kitchen, tying on an apron and helping set out dishes. She avoided the dining room, her eyes fixed on the counter, moving plates around rather than sitting at the table where Linda used to prop her up for attention. Ryan, on the other hand, still tried to claw at scraps of the spotlight. He sat down, leaned back in his chair, and dropped a line about working on a new project. He didn't even explain what it was. The room gave him nothing but polite nods before moving the conversation elsewhere. My uncle redirected things toward me, congratulating me on a recent corporate contract I had landed. The table lit up with questions. What company? How I got it? How the project was going? Relatives leaned in, genuinely interested, and the energy was warm, animated. I glanced across the table and saw Linda stiffen. For the first time, no one pivoted back to her children. Even her husband, who had always chimed in with exaggerated details to boost her stories, stayed silent. He cut his ham, sipped his drink, and said nothing. It was like he had decided not to get involved anymore. Dinner carried on until one of the younger cousins, bold as ever, turned to Claire and asked bluntly what she was really doing these days. The question landed like a stone in water. Linda's fork froze in her hand. She opened her mouth to answer, but Claire beat her to it. She hesitated, looked around the table, then admitted she was taking classes at a community college. She said it simply, without flourish. The reaction wasn't shame, not even judgment. Relatives nodded, some smiled, and a few offered supportive comments about how smart it was to take things one step at a time. They treated her like any other young adult figuring life out, which was the complete opposite of the pedestal Linda had built. Linda tried to spin it, calling it a temporary stepping stone and insisting bigger plans were ahead, but nobody engaged. The family just moved on, asking about Easter egg hunts and joking about who was stealing all the dinner rolls. Linda's words hung in the air, unwanted. Ryan grew defensive as the night went on. When the conversation turned to another cousin's job promotion, he muttered under his breath that the family only cared about tearing people down. People glanced at him, then looked away, offering him no sympathy. The eye rolls around the table said everything. Later, while clearing plates, one of my aunts pulled me aside. She lowered her voice and told me Linda had been asking around for financial help. She'd approached a few relatives, hinting about bills and Ryan's business expenses, but no one wanted to hand her money anymore. They were done enabling her. By dessert, the shift was complete. Linda sat quietly, occasionally trying to interject, but no one fed her energy. Conversations bubbled with stories of new houses, school plays, promotions, vacations, even recipes. Real tangible accomplishments that people could celebrate together. Linda's bragging throne wasn't just empty, it had been replaced with skepticism. Every time she spoke, relatives exchanged glances, waiting for the catch. Claire stayed in the kitchen most of the night, but when she did join the table for pie, she looked more at ease. She wasn't being paraded anymore. Ryan sat slouched, scrolling on his phone, ignored by the cousins who used to pretend to be impressed. By the time we packed up leftovers and coats, it was clear Linda's reign was over. The power she had held for years, making everyone else feel smaller so her kids could look bigger, was gone. All that remained was silence around her chair, the family finally free to celebrate genuine milestones instead of made-up ones. And Linda, for once, had nothing left to say.